Many of you are probably waking up to the news or just hearing through the grapevine through the last 24 or when this video releases 48 hours of the Azerbaijani military launching a pretty massive military operation into Nagorno-Karabakh. I would classify it as an invasion. This video right here is what I saw, which confirmed it first for me. It wasn't from Popular Front, but this is them republishing it. I like Popular Front, so I'm using them. This is air raid sirens, which has become a very familiar sound for me here in Ukraine, being recorded in the city. This is in what is the de facto capital of the breaker. I don't know if we're going to call it a breakaway region or the de facto state of Nagorno-Karabakh. This was in the capital as they launched an operation basically along the entire contact line with Nagorno-Karabakh, capturing positions, shelling military formations, and the city itself, which we're going to show some footage of in a second. But here's the video that I first saw. So you can hear what to me sounds like drones. It's at least familiar to me. Sean, thank you so much for the sub. To me sounds like drones. You can hear machine gun fire, and a lot of the other footage you can hear the fire of artillery. You know, we called it, at least in the aid groups I worked with, like thunder without the storm, because in the distance it really sounds like a thunderstorm. And I've actually confused artillery with thunderstorms on multiple occasions if we're getting shelled during a storm. So we called it thunder without the storm. But it seems that the Armenians are launching a full operation in the region, and the media apparatus of Azerbaijan and of Turkey especially has already kicked into full gear, trying to explain as to why they are invading Armenia. Depending on who you are, but they're invading Nagorno-Karabakh. They're calling it an anti-terrorist operation. And they're saying that they're protecting civilians, that everything's fine. Let me just show you one example of the media apparatus enshrining and pushing out the Azerbaijani position. Here's TRT World, just straight up quoting the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry, saying that they won't target civilians and infrastructure is not being targeted, and they're only targeting legitimate military targets. Let's play a little bit of what they were playing on TRT World.
Well, the Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense has said that their forces are conducting localized counter-terror operations focusing on the military infrastructure of the Armenian separatists in the Karabakh region. Most of that military infrastructure, according to senior officials I've spoken to here in Baku, is in and around the areas where the Russian...
So the green area is, you know, Nagorno-Karabakh, where, you know, there's Armenians living in it, and it's controlled by the Armenians. The yellowish like line areas are territory that was captured by the Azerbaijanis, which was captured in another war 3 years ago. Around the same time, actually, we're coming. I see right there, December 1st, 2020. We're coming up to the 3-year anniversary of that war. They invaded, trying to retake this territory. We're going to talk about the history of this in a moment, but that's what that yellow area is. It was territory that was captured of Nagorno-Karabakh in the last 3 years during that war. The blue is Armenia, and the other shade of green to the east here is Azerbaijan.
Peacekeepers are currently stationed in Karabakh. Those peacekeepers are there as part of that 2020 ceasefire deal following the 44-day war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where Azerbaijan came out victorious on the battlefield. According to the senior foreign policy advisor to the president of Azerbaijan, who I spoke to yesterday, he told me that Azerbaijan cannot afford to have 10,000 soldiers from the Armenian regular army stationed in Karabakh, where the Azerbaijani government believes that they will continue to threaten the security of Azerbaijani civilians that are coming back to Karabakh. Those are the internally displaced Azerbaijani civilians that, after 30 years of war and occupation, are returning back to Karabakh as part of the Great Return campaign that the Azerbaijani government has instituted. Now,
okay, I've heard enough of the Azerbaijani state line. Okay, I think we've heard enough. So there is well, first off, as for the point that civilians are not being targeted, there's already been a report of about at least 27 civilians being killed, but I want to clarify that that number is most likely higher. 27 civilians killed by Azerbaijani shelling. The number is probably higher because a lot of the villages where the shelling is going on, it doesn't have great communication infrastructure, and that communication infrastructure has been broken already and destroyed by the shelling, so they can't really communicate. If anybody else has been killed, anybody else has been hurt, children have been injured in the shelling, and there has been examples of civilian infrastructure in the Nagorno-Karabakh capital and other locations being shelled by the Azerbaijani military, as has been documented by civilian journalists on the ground. Here is just some footage of just civilians reacting to the shelling. But yeah, you can see civilian housing, civilian cars. These are not military installations. This isn't terribly surprising to me, and I don't think it is terribly surprising to anyone who's paid enough attention to this war. This war is extremely hate-filled. There's a lot of resentment in this war, and the Azerbaijani military has a terrible human rights record. I mean, like, beheadings, murders of POWs, murders of civilians, the targeting of civilians, just like the torture, allegations of torture. I'm just not a fantastic reputation when it comes to the human rights record of the Azerbaijani military. So the idea of a high amount of civilian casualties coming from this invasion, that is not something that would be terribly surprising to me. And it wouldn't just be because, you know, any military operation, there are going to be civilian deaths. I do not believe that the Azerbaijani military really cares much at all about protecting the Armenian civilians from their onslaught. I don't believe they really care. But putting that aside, what was that TV host talking about with, you know, 30 years of occupation and all these people being displaced? Why are the Azerbaijanis invading? Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and people talk about the peaceful collapse of the Soviet, or the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's dissolution was not peaceful, right? And I don't need to just talk about this war. I could talk about Transnistria. I could even say that, you know, the war between Russia and Ukraine is, in a way, also a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. I could talk about the Russian invasion of Georgia, Chechnya, the two Chechen wars, but this is another example. There was, and I think one of the best direct examples of the dissolution of the Soviet Union not being that peaceful. When the Soviet Union dissolved, there, and I'm going to dumb this down as much as possible. I know there's probably people who care a lot about this war who are like, Dylan should include this information. You can put it in the comments, you can put it in other places, but I can only give as much information as possible in a short period of time while keeping people's attention. I got to choose carefully, because if I just drop like 20 minutes of an explainer, then people are going to forget. People will remember maybe like 2 or 3 minutes. So I just want to keep it simple. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a disagreement between the Azerbaijani government and the Armenian government and many of the locals in Nagorno-Karabakh about what the future borders of these two states would look like and who would get what. And this caused a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Many of the people in Nagorno-Karabakh were Armenians, and they did not want to be part of an Azerbaijani government. And this spiraled out into a lot of violence, and the violence was very, very brutal. Many people fled and became internally displaced persons, leaving their homes forever in both Armenian-controlled territory and in Azerbaijani-controlled territory as well, even though, you know, sometimes that isn't highlighted as much because of the outcome of the war. The war ended with an Armenian victory. The Azerbaijani military was terribly unorganized, was not well led, and it went into complete disaster. And with the Armenians somewhat backed up, at least with security guarantees by the Russians, as they have been for the last 20, 25, 30 years, they were able to fight a quick war to victory, taking control of all of Nagorno-Karabakh, basically. This was the status quo up until 2020. In the years leading up to 2020, more and more we saw the trend of Azerbaijan becoming wealthier, Azerbaijan becoming more powerful, Azerbaijan being as nationalistic as ever and wanting to reclaim the territory. None of those sympathies went away, but their means to do it increased. This is all while Armenia had its own internal political strife and a bunch of other things that I don't want to get into right now that led it to not increasing its military potential that much. And then 2020 came around. There was a brief war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Armenia got clapped, if I'm just going to put it lightly. This was due to a lot of factors. What is often highlighted was Azerbaijan's very effective use of drones, particularly the Bayraktar drone. Many of you might know the Bayraktar from its use during the war in Ukraine during the early stages of the defense of Kiev by Ukrainian forces. But it was also first brought onto the world stage, or made its big debut on the world stage, during Azerbaijani operations in Nagorno-Karabakh against the Armenian military, because Azerbaijan is a deep ally of Turkey. What happened was that the Azerbaijani military liberated, at least according to them, a lot of territory, not all of Nagorno-Karabakh, but a lot of Nagorno-Karabakh, a lot of the more uninhabited parts of it, not any of the like really gigantic major cities, but this territory that they took made it more separated from Armenia than ever, and allowed them to basically completely encircle Nagorno-Karabakh. And this complete encirclement of Nagorno-Karabakh, ever since December of last year, has been used to enforce a very, I would say, brutal blockade over Armenia. This blockade has stopped any medicine, has stopped any food, and this is probably the most important part for the Azerbaijanis, has stopped most transportation of, for say, like military supplies into Nagorno-Karabakh to, use in defense against an Azerbaijani invasion. But what I most cared about was the blockading of the medicine and the food, which to this day, the Azerbaijani government still denies. They still deny they enforced the blockade. They still deny they enforced the blockade of food, of medicine, of anything. In fact, for a long time, they were saying it wasn't them blockading the road, it was environmental activists. And they had people, and I mean this for real, dress up like environmental activists, really like hardcore Azerbaijani nationalists, go to the one corridor that existed between Armenia proper and Nagorno-Karabakh and block any shipments. And this blockade would go to some pretty, I would just say, cruel extent. For example, there were times where elderly people wanted to evacuate from Nagorno-Karabakh and ambulances, and they were blocked. As of a few weeks ago, there were even reports of people dying of starvation, as both food and medicine have become of great short supply within Nagorno-Karabakh due to this blockade. And during this blockade, Azerbaijan built up their forces on the border for what they call training exercises. For anybody who remembered the early stages of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that might ring some bells. There was some concern in the last few weeks of whether these training exercises were for real or if they were built up for an invasion. And now we have our answer. They were built up for an Azerbaijani invasion. As I don't know if I said this earlier, but as of right now, 27 civilians are reported to have died. Children are among the casualties, among the injured. As far as we know, as of right now, no children are dead. These numbers are expected to rise as communication right now is not fantastic. Communication infrastructure is being targeted. There's a very decent chance this stuff is being jammed. And the Azerbaijani military seemingly has smashed through multiple points along the line of contact and is advancing and capturing territory. And there are reports that villages with Armenian populations have already been encircled by the Azerbaijani military, and there is great concern for what's going to happen to those civilians if and when the Azerbaijani military moves in and captures them. Are they just going to force them all out? Are they going to kill them and execute them? Are there going to be other atrocities committed? That is the concern for anybody watching from the outside, but of course also for those living on the ground with this day to day. now that I've given you guys, I think, a basic breakdown of what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, or why the Azerbaijanis have invaded, I just want to quickly state that I think this invasion is pointless. And when I say pointless, I mean it's not going to stop terrorism in the way that the Azerbaijani government is saying, like an anti-terrorism operation. It's not stopping terrorism. It isn't an anti-terror operation. I mean, children are being injured, civilians are being killed. It feels like the terror has been brought to Armenia. That's my personal opinion. The blockade has also intensified that terror for the local civilian population. The Armenian government has already basically given up any claims over Nagorno-Karabakh. I understand that they still disagree about what the future of Nagorno-Karabakh should be. The Armenian government is saying that it wants security guarantees for the civilians living there. The Azerbaijani government says it doesn't need to give them any security guarantees because it's their territory and they are not going to have another country, Armenia, dictate to them security guarantees for their territory. But I do believe that security guarantees should be given to the civilians living there, that they will not be forced out of their homes, have their houses burnt down, or killed by the Azerbaijani military, which has a well-known reputation of killing people who are unarmed and can't shoot back. So this is something that I don't believe from a humanitarian standpoint is necessary. I also think that there are multiple parties that would be willing to host negotiations between both sides. And lastly, the Armenians don't have really any leverage. The Russians are not there to defend them. There's no way the Russians are going to send in any military to respond to this, even though technically the Armenians are in a military alliance with them. They're not going to come. They're too tied up in Ukraine, and recent statements from the Russian government seems to express a certain amount of frustration towards the Armenians that they aren't with them on Ukraine and not in favor of the invasion, and that they're starting to look elsewhere since the Russians won't defend them. A good example of this would be Dmitry Medvedev, known drunkard and Russian loon, but also former president of Russia and Russian government official, came out basically lecturing the Armenians, saying this is all their fault, and maybe if they were more loyal to Russia, this wouldn't be happening. Here it is. One day, one of my colleagues from a fraternal country told me, "Well, I'm a stranger to you. You won't accept me." I answered what I had to. "We will judge not by biography, but by actions." Then he lost the war, but strangely remained in place. Then he decided to blame Russia for his defeat. Then he gave up part of the territory of his country. Then he decided to flirt with NATO, and his wife defiantly went to her enemies with cookies. Guess what fate awaits him? Now, what is not included here is that Armenia didn't really have much of a choice about whether it was going to give up certain territory. Armenia didn't really have much of a choice on whether they were going to, go and talk to other people, because if Russia wasn't going to come defend them, they have to go look for other defense and security partners. But I'm getting a little off topic about the reasons why I think this is pointless. But let me just sum up why I don't think this invasion should be happening. Number one, it's humanitarian catastrophe that is intensifying what was already a horrible situation with the blockade. Number two, there were multiple parties that could sit down and intermediate discussions between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And number three, everybody already knows what the outcome will be. Nobody is of any belief that the Armenians are going to rush towards some incredible victory here. But it seems like the Azerbaijanis are unwilling to compromise on any level when it comes to the return of that territory to the Azerbaijani government. It seems that they are unwilling to compromise, even if the Armenians also have been a little, I don't want to use the word two-faced, but a little touch and go about what they mean when they're going to leave Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijani control, or they no longer recognize it as controlled by their territory, if they're going to pull out troops, etc., when they're going to pull out troops, etc. But none of this, I think, is necessary. We already know what the outcome of the war is going to be. Civilians are pointlessly dying, and it's intensifying what was already a horrific humanitarian situation with shortages of medicine, which is going to be very important for civilians getting bombed, and a shortage of food. As for the Russian element of this, which we were trying to highlight here, I'd also want to point out that this is the Russian perspective of it, but there's also an Armenian perspective of it, which is very, very angry with the Russians. Here is footage of protesters in Armenia's capital yelling about Putin, insulting him, and basically saying that Putin was too busy invading other countries to defend countries that are being invaded.
Организации, которые Путин создавал, чтобы порабощать и колонизировать свободолюбивые народы постсоветского пространства. Лавров, сука! Лавров, сука! Лавров, сука! Лавров, сука!
So they're cursing both Lavrov, who is Russia's foreign minister, and Putin. They're cursing both of them. But this isn't that surprising that the Armenian public has completely turned against the Russians. Not only were the Armenian public not on board with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but many of them knew, once they got bogged down, what this would mean in the long term for their relationship with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has watched Russia, which has been Armenia's main security guarantor, fall on a sword by its own fruition, through its own actions in Ukraine. And now that it's busy lowering its body deeper and deeper into that sword, it cannot come to the defense of Armenia against the Azerbaijani invasion. Azerbaijan, with a much bigger military and with a much larger economy, now fighting against Armenia, who no longer has its main security backer. I was talking about this earlier before we started the segment, but a year ago, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was probably a few months into it, once they started to bog down, the Azerbaijanis tested something. They started shelling Armenia proper and even entered what is internationally recognized as Armenian territory. So we're not talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, which is recognized as Azerbaijani territory internationally, but we're talking about what is internationally recognized as Armenian territory, but the Azerbaijani government, due to its quite frankly, ultra-nationalist leanings, view multiple pieces of Armenian territory as what is internationally recognized as Armenian territory as parts of Azerbaijani territory. When they entered Armenia proper, which is protected by every single part of the defense agreement that they have with Russia, you know, Russia always used the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh isn't recognized as Armenia proper to kind of, you know, slide out of any obligations, out of a few peacekeepers here, a few peacekeepers there. But they couldn't really slide out of the obligation of defending Armenia proper, or so we thought. They did nothing. Not only did they did nothing, but the Azerbaijanis went further, and they bombed Russian FSB agents that were in the country. They bombed them while they were in a vehicle. I remember the photo. As clear as day, I can see the image in my mind right now. And the Russians didn't do anything. And I've said this before when it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've said this again. I've said it before a million times, and I'll say it again a million times. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a massive strategic blunder on so many levels. But one level that is often overlooked is that now that Russia has committed like 90 to 95% of its military potential to either fighting in Ukraine or supplementing the war in Ukraine, either through rotations or being along the border to stop cross-border raids or air defense systems in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or in wherever. Now that they've dedicated the vast majority of their resources to fighting in Ukraine, they don't have enough for another security arrangement, for another security crisis. The Wagner coup, the Wagner mutiny, whatever you want to call it, the march on Moscow, right? Wagner's Thunder Run showed that. And they're much more preoccupied with stopping another Thunder Run on Moscow and trying to salvage this disastrous clusterfuck of an invasion in Ukraine than they are in defending their allies that are part of their security arrangements. And Armenia is a part of CSTO, which is Russia's version of NATO. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's the closest we can get to an equivalent. And all of that meant nothing because they have made it so they can't do anything. And so while we while this is terrible for Armenia, and it's terrible for the civilians living in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenians put all their chips in one basket, and that basket is led by a fucking madman who's an expansionist, an ultra-nationalist, a colonialist, and an imperialist, and, quite frankly, a fascist who is set on rebuilding an empire much more than standing up and defending their allies. And this is the result. This is why Armenia is also going out and looking for other allies. This is why Armenia just had military exercises with the United States like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Now, a lot of those military exercises was not in relation to what we're seeing right now. A lot of it seemed to be riot control methods, which, I mean, is a little, a little concerning, but still, they're military training operations with the United States, which is probably part of the reason why Russia is so pissed right now. But what could Armenia do? If its main security guarantor is doing nothing to defend them, even when their own agents are shelled, even with their own internationally recognized territory is intruded upon, they have to look elsewhere. Where are they going to look? They're going to look towards the United States. They're going to look towards the European Union, which is a major purchaser of Azerbaijani oil and gas. And if Azerbaijan loses its European markets, oh boy, all that wealth that's built up over the years, I mean, that's going to take a hit. Would they be willing to take that hit? Are the Europeans willing to take that hit? That I'm extremely skeptical of, especially after taking the Russian energy hit. But another ally, and I think this is going to probably be one of their most consistent allies, at least in the years to come, or we have at least the most proof that they're going to be one of the most consistent allies, because they have been, even though a lot of Westerners don't know this, is Iran. Iran is very concerned about Turkish regional ambitions. Turkey is very close with Azerbaijan. Iran is also very concerned about Azerbaijani territorial ambitions, because if Azerbaijan has expansionist goals, there is also territory within Iran that has an Azerbaijani population. And so if they have expansionist goals in Armenia, could they have expansionist goals somewhere else? So it acts as both a counterbalance to Turkish power in the region and, of course, a defense of their own, or what they see as their own, territorial integrity. It's the same reason why the Iranians don't want to see a Kurdish state in Iraq, because then if they have a Kurdish state in Iraq, that might give the Kurds in Iran ideas. And the Kurds in Iran have been extremely rebellious and very persistent in the fact that they want some version of autonomy. So Iran is probably going to be in Armenia's corner. Armenia is looking for allies elsewhere in the United States, possibly in Europe, possibly, France, Sweden, etc. I know Sweden has come out with a statement condemning this operation. Many European powers, including the European Union, has come out with statements condemning this. Whether it's going to be more than within words and it's actually going to come with actions, we have yet to see if that's going to be the case. I don't have much else to say about this. The last thing I want to say is the threat of ethnic cleansing, I think, is very real. The rhetoric, this is a postcard, an Azerbaijani postcard from 2020, after the military invasion then. I think you can get the themes just from looking at postcard. I think the rhetoric from the Azerbaijani government is extremely scary. I think the actions of the Azerbaijani military are horrendous. Definitely constitute war crimes for what they were doing in 2020. And I have seen no cultural shift either in larger Azerbaijani society or within the Azerbaijani military that leads me to believe that they're going to change their actions. Definitely when they're fighting in war, that they are openly stating is basically, at least in part, motivated by revenge. So this is not going to be if this spirals out into a wider war where the Armenian government is sending their entire armed forces and not just what they already have in Nagorno-Karabakh along with local militias, whether this becomes a larger war and is not isolated to Nagorno-Karabakh itself, we have yet to see. That could expand the violence. It seems so far the Armenian government is hesitant to send its forces into battle, to launch, to being part of that type of a larger war, because they probably see the writing on the wall and understand that they probably would lose. And if they probably would lose, then why would they throw their men into that meat grinder? Then again, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh are fighting, but they're fighting for their homes, and people will do incredible things once they're fighting for their homes. This whole thing is a disaster. I believe it could have been avoided, and is, in part, a ripple effect from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's part of the stabilizing effect of them falling on the sword.